Martha Ellison had lived alone in the high country of the Montana frontier for almost 3 years by the time the first footprints appeared, and solitude was something she had learned to wear like an extra layer of clothing, heavy at first, suffocating at times, then strangely comforting once broken in. After her husband, Daniel, was taken by the fever that swept through the Bitterroot Valley during one brutal winter, she had stayed on their land because she couldn't bear to leave the last place where his voice still felt alive in the wooden beams and the old pine floors. Her cabin stood on a rise overlooking thick stretches of forest, where the wind moaned through the branches at night, and if you didn't know any better, you might think the land itself breathed. For months, her only company had been the occasional passing trapper, a deer wandering too close to the garden, or the distant echo of wolves calling each other under a moonlit sky. But one late autumn morning, before the sun had fully pushed the darkness aside, she opened her door to fetch firewood and froze in the cold air as her eyes fell on a trail of footprints, human footprints, circling her cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. They weren't her own. They were larger, heavier, the impressions deep enough to suggest that whoever made them had been standing still in certain spots, watching. What chilled her wasn't just the footprints, it was that the trail ended abruptly, a few yards away, disappearing into undisturbed snow as if the person had simply dissolved into the morning air. She stood there, a long moment, breath smoking out in front of her, her heart pattering like a loose shutter in a storm. Her land was secluded, too secluded. Nobody ever came up that ridge, unless they meant to. She followed the prints with her eyes, counting slow circles around the cabin, once near the windows, once by the barn, once all the way around to the back door, each step patient, unhurried, as though the stranger had all night to study her life, her routines, and the quiet vulnerability of a woman living alone. That night, Martha barred the doors, shoved wood against the windows, and kept her rifle close. Yet the forest was loud with the typical noises, the cracking of branches, the running of animals, but underneath it she felt a hum of wrongness, like a presence lingering beyond the tree line, waiting for her lamp to go out. She barely slept. The next morning brought an even more unnerving sight, a single footprint directly beneath her bedroom window, pressed deep as though someone had stood there for hours listening to her breathe. This time her stomach dropped. She ran outside scanning the snow, but again the tracks simply ended after a few steps. No return path, no direction of approach. As if the stranger emerged from nowhere. She walked inside, bolting the door, whispering to herself that maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe someone lost. But those comfort lies were thin and transparent, and she knew it. Her instincts clawed at her. She was being watched. As days passed, she began hearing faint taps on the walls after sundown, light, deliberate, too measured to be a branch or settling wood. Once, just before dawn, she awoke to the unmistakable sound of someone brushing their hand slowly across the outside of the cabin wall. A breath froze in her throat as she clutched Daniel's old revolver, its metal cold as death. But the moment she lit the lantern, the sound vanished, swallowed by the silence. She knew she couldn't stay quiet about it any longer. 3 days later, she rode into town, hands trembling on the reins. The sheriff, a stout man named Clareton, listened to her story with brows pinched tight. "Probably a drifter," he muttered, though his eyes flickered. He didn't believe that for a second. "Tracks that start and end in the middle of snow don't make sense," she insisted. "Nothing makes sense." She saw him weigh the truth in her trembling voice. Finally he nodded. "I'll send someone to check it out. In the meantime, stay aware." But when she returned home before dusk, something made her halt before even reaching the porch. The door to her cabin was slightly open. She never left it that way. Pulse pounding, she stepped inside, holding her rifle in both hands. Her chair was moved, her lamp was lit, and on the small wooden table, something sat that made her knees weaken, a pine cone wrapped in twine, tied delicately like a gift. It meant nothing to her, yet felt intimate, almost symbolic, like someone leaving a calling card. Panic welled in her chest. She searched the entire cabin, attic to cellar, every corner, shouting challenges into the empty air. Nothing, no one. But the scent of cold earth lingered in the room like someone had been there only minutes before. That night she didn't sleep at all. She sat upright in her rocking chair, rifle laid across her lap, watching the shadows sway across the walls. The wind howled, but at intervals it seemed to carry whispers, faint, distant, as though someone murmured her name from the darkness. By morning she looked drained, her eyes raw and red. The footprints returned that day, this time forming a path from the barn directly to her door, straight, purposeful, fearless. They stopped at her porch, toes pointed toward her. She stared at them a long time, her heart slamming against her ribs, her throat dry with terror. Whoever this was, they wanted her to know they were not afraid of being seen. In fact, they wanted her attention. That evening, Martha sat before the fire, trembling, realizing she couldn't outrun the isolation of the mountains, nor the unknown force circling closer each night. Whether it was a person, or something far older than the settlements that dotted the frontier, she didn't know. But one thing was clear: she was no longer alone on her land, and whatever walked around her cabin had come with intention. The kind that doesn't simply go away, the kind that eventually enters. She drew a deep breath and whispered into the crackling fire, "Daniel, if you can hear me, I could use you now." And somewhere in the distance, a single slow knock echoed from the dark woods, one that didn't belong to wind or branch or beast. It belonged to whatever was coming for her. Martha lasted only a few minutes after that knock before her instincts pushed her toward action. She grabbed her coat, her rifle, a lantern, and paced in front of the door like a caged animal. She could no longer tell whether the fear inside her was worse than the dread of not knowing what haunted the edges of her land. She waited, ears pricked, as the forest thickened with darkness. The moon was a thin silver slash in the sky, peeking between clouds that threatened snow. Each shadow outside seemed to pulse with possibility. A man, a creature, a memory made flesh. Around midnight, she heard soft crunches in the snow, slow, precise steps circling the cabin once more. She held the lantern near the window, watching the light flicker on her trembling hands. The steps moved behind the cabin, then stopped. Silence fell heavy. Martha steadied her breath. Something inside her snapped from fear into defiance. "Enough of this," she muttered. She threw open the door and stepped out into the night, rifle raised, lantern blazing like a beacon in her hand. The cold slapped her face instantly. The snow around her glittered, and then she saw them, fresh footprints leading Toa. R&D, the tree line. They were clearer than ever, deep, spaced far apart, like the stride of a man tall and powerful. Without letting herself hesitate, she followed. Her boots crunched in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. The forest swallowed her lantern glow in its tall dark arms, but she pushed on, compelled by something she didn't fully understand. The footprints led deeper and deeper, twisting between pines, across a frozen creek, up a slope where the wind howled through broken branches. She didn't stop until she saw a faint movement up ahead, a flicker, like someone ducking behind a fallen tree. She raised her rifle. "Show yourself," she called, her voice cracking. No answer, only the sound of her breathing and the eerie stillness around her. She stepped toward the fallen tree, heart pounding against her ribs, and lifted the lantern overhead. The light spilled across bark, snow, and nothing. No one. The footprints ended here as if the person had stepped behind the trunk and vanished. Her fear returned in a cold rush, crawling up her spine. She backed away slowly, but then something caught her eye. A figure standing far behind her near the creek she had crossed, tall, motionless, a silhouette darker than the forest around it. She swung the lantern toward it, but the moment the light touched where it stood, the figure drifted backward, swallowed by the shadows. It didn't run. It didn't turn. It simply faded. Panic surged through her. She spun around and hurried back toward the cabin, her breath ragged, her boots slipping over icy patches. She didn't stop until her cabin came into view through the trees, but when she reached it, her lantern sputtered and nearly went out as she froze in horror. More footprints, dozens of them, surrounding her cabin in swirling, overlapping patterns as though a crowd had gathered there while she was gone. They weren't here when she left. They couldn't have been. She had walked through this same snow moments earlier. Her pulse hammered. She staggered backward, staring at the chaotic pattern, feeling watched from every direction. "This isn't human," she whispered. And then, as if responding, a low groan rose from the forest behind her, deep, mournful, long. She whirled around but saw nothing. The groan rose again, this time closer, vibrating through the cold air like a warning. She turned and sprinted for the cabin, bursting inside and slamming the door behind her. For hours she sat in the dark, rifle trembling in her hands, Lantern extinguished to avoid giving herself away. The knocking came again. First one slow knock on the front wall, then another on the back, then on the left side, then the right, as though something circled her home, tapping gently, patiently, almost curiously. Sometimes it sounded like knuckles, sometimes like claws. She pressed her palms to her ears, tears streaming. "Please stop," she whispered. The knocking ceased immediately. Silence returned, total, suffocating. She lowered her hands, her breath catching. Then, from directly above her, on the cabin roof, came a heavy footstep. Then another, and another, slow, purposeful. Something was walking on her roof. She aimed her rifle upward, choking on her breath. The footsteps traveled from one end of the roof to the other, pausing directly over her head. Then, stillness. A long minute passed, then 2, then 5. She felt the pressure building, terror crowning like a storm inside her chest. She swallowed hard and shouted, "What do you want from me?" Her voice cracked across the cabin walls. For several seconds, nothing happened. And then, another heavy step above her, a thud so strong that dust rained from the ceiling. Martha screamed and ran to the fireplace, throwing the lantern into flame. As the fire sparked brighter, a shadow crossed the window, a tall figure standing just outside. She gasped and aimed her rifle, but before she could fire, the shadow slid out of sight. A moment later, the knocking returned, this time gentle, rhythmic, like someone requesting entry. Knock, knock, knock. She backed away, shaking her head, whispering, "No, no." And then she heard it, a voice, faint, muffled, familiar. "Martha." The sound hit her like a blow to the chest. It was Daniel's voice, her dead husband's voice. Her lips parted, her rifle dipped. "Daniel?" she whispered, stepping closer to the door. The voice came again, clearer. "Let me in, Martha." Tears blurred her vision, her throat tightened. She reached toward the door latch. Her heart wanted to believe, needed to believe, but a cold instinct stabbed through her grief. Daniel had been gone for years, buried in the frozen soil of the valley cemetery. Slowly, painfully, she retracted her hand. "You're not him," she said, trembling. The voice outside shifted tones, deepening, cracking like dry wood. "Let me in." A chill spread across her skin as the voice warped into something guttural and wrong. She backed away, screaming, "Leave me alone!" And the moment those words echoed, all footprints around the cabin trembled, collapsing into the snow as though stepped on by invisible feet. The entire cabin shook. The forest answered with a low, resonant rumble. The tapping stopped. The footsteps vanished from the roof. The presence withdrew, melting back into the trees like fog dragged by the wind. And just like that, the night fell utterly still. When dawn finally broke, Martha stepped outside with shaking legs and found the snow pristine, untouched. No footprints, no signs of intrusion, nothing to prove the events were real except for the terror that clung to her bones. She knew she couldn't live alone anymore, not with something lurking in the forest that mimicked voices and vanished into thin air. She packed her belongings, loaded her horse, and rode to town without looking back. Neighbors later said the land near her old cabin always felt strange, colder than the rest of the ridge. Travelers claimed they saw footprints in the snow around the abandoned cabin, footprints that appeared even when no one was there, and some nights, if the wind was right, they swore they heard a woman's voice whispering from the trees, warning others to leave while they still could. As for Martha, she lived the rest of her life in a small town nearby, surrounded by people, warmth, noise, anything to drown out the memory of what walked around her cabin in the dead of night. She never returned, and whenever someone asked what truly happened up there, she would simply look away and say, "Some things aren't meant to be understood, only respected."